which has been very effective for the West, demonizing Russia and making claims that have no substance, but people don't remember the history of these things. They're rather complex. So no, Russia was not in any respect responsible for the massive destruction of the city of Aleppo.
How would you contrast the methods of warfare followed by Russia as opposed to the U.S. and allied forces in Syria?
Well, first of all, the American involvement, the United States war against Syria is a war of aggression. We put the Central Intelligence, it's a highly secretive CIA Special Activities Center. These are kind of the James Bond guys of the Central Intelligence Agency, total Machiavellian. They will do anything. It's no holds barred with these guys. We sent them in and we started the war in Syria. The war didn't exist until we sent the CIA to coordinate with Al-Qaeda elements. So we began the war, and we were not invited into Syria. In fact, the United States has seized two significant parts of Syria. One is a very major part. The Euphrates River bisects, or doesn't bisect, it carves off about a third of the northern part of Syria. The United States invaded that portion. We actually put troops on the ground, illegal against any standard international law of war. It was just a seizure, and this was something that was referred to by John Kerry, who was then the Secretary of State, and he was frustrated at the tremendous victory by the Syrian armed forces against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And he said, well, we probably need to move to Plan B. He didn't announce what Plan B was, but it unfolded over time. Plan B was the American seizure of that northern portion of Syria. The importance of taking that part of Syria is that it is the breadbasket for all of the Syrian people. That is where the wheat, Syria actually had a significant wheat surplus, and the people were very well fed in Syria before the war. We wanted to take the wheat away to cause famine among the Syrian people. The other thing we were able to do is to seize the major part of the oil and natural gas fields. Those also were produced in that northern portion beyond the Euphrates River. And the idea was that by stealing the oil and the gas, we would be able to shut down the transportation system. And at the same time, during the Syrian winters, we could freeze to death the Syrian civilian population, which in many cases were living in rubble, where these terrorist armies with mechanized divisions had attacked and just totally destroyed these cities and left people just living in little pockets of rubble. We wanted to starve, and we wanted to freeze to death the people of Syria, and that was Plan B. Now, we became frustrated at a certain point that somehow these Syrians, these darn Syrians, it's a tiny little country, and why are these people resilient? They're fighting against 2/3 of the entire military and industrial force of the world. How can a nation of 23 million people possibly withstand this for over a decade. And so we decided we had to take action or we were going to totally lose Syria. And so the US Congress imposed the Caesar sanctions. The Caesar sanctions were the most brutal sanctions ever imposed on any nation. I mean, during the Second World War, sanctions were not nearly as strict as they were on Syria. We weren't at war with Syria, and yet we had a naval blockade around the country. We devalued their currency through the SWIFT system for international payments, making it impossible for them to purchase medications. So you had Syrian women who would contract breast cancer, just like we have here in this country. But instead of here in this country, where breast cancer has become relatively treatable, we cut off the medical supplies so that the women in Syria would die of breast cancer because they could not get the medications because we slammed their dollars through the SWIFT system. One of the last things that we did, and the evidence is vague on it, but there was a mysterious explosion in the harbor in Lebanon. And it was a massive explosion of a shipload of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. It killed hundreds of Lebanese people. It wounded thousands and thousands, destroyed the economy of Lebanon, and most importantly, it destroyed the banking system of Lebanon, which was one of the few lifelines remaining to Syria. I don't think that explosion was accidental. I think it was orchestrated, and I suspect that the Central Intelligence Agency was aware of the nation that carried out that action to destroy Beirut Harbor. But throughout, you see this Machiavellian approach where we use unlimited force and violence. And at the same time, we control the global media to where we erase all discussions of what's truly happening. So to the man, the woman in the street, they think things are fine. Everything is being done for altruistic reasons, but it's not.
Part of your military service was as a JAG officer, and for a period of time, you were the Army's head of the criminal law division at the Pentagon. And in that light, what do you see as the of how these Caesar sanctions? How would you look at those from the perspective of international law and military law?
Well, now, I was not the international law expert. I was the criminal law expert, but I would say that making war on a civilian population is a crime of grave significance in the law of war. One of the things that we did as we allied ourselves with Al Qaeda and on and off with ISIS, I mean, we fought ISIS in a very serious way, but at the same time, we often employed them to use against the Syrian government. So it's kind of a love-hate, but we have always worked with the terrorists. They were the core. One of the policies that was followed was that under this extreme version of Islam, this Wahhabism, there was this notion that you possess a woman that you seize with your strong right arm in battle. This goes back to the 7th century. And so we facilitated the movement of Islamic terrorists from 100 countries. And they came and they joined ISIS, they joined Al Qaeda, they joined the Free Syrian Army, all of these different ones. And one of the things that they knew when they arrived is that they were lawfully entitled to murder the husbands. I'm not talking about military people, I'm talking about civilian. They could murder the husbands, they could kill them, and then they could possess and own their wives and their children. And they did it in vast numbers. And so there was a campaign of rape. It was an organized campaign of rape across the nation of Syria. And there actually were slave markets that arose in certain of these rebel areas where they actually had price lists of the different women. And interestingly, the highest prices went to the youngest children, because there were a great number of pedophiles, and the pedophiles wanted to possess small children because under the laws that were applied, they were permitted to rape these children repeatedly. They were able to rape the widows of the slain soldiers or the slain civilians and possess them and buy them and sell them among themselves. This went on. I'm not saying that the CIA created this policy, but they understood that it was a widespread policy and they condoned it. They never criticized it in any way. This was so bad that I spoke with President Assad, who shared with me that they were in the process when I visited in 2016. I was in a number of battle zones and in the capital, and I met with the president, and he said that at that time they were working on legislation in the parliament to change the law of citizenship. They had always followed the Islamic law, which was that a child's citizenship derived from the father. But there were so many tens, hundreds of thousands of Syrian women impregnated by these terrorists who were imported into Syria that it was necessary to change the law so that they would have Syrian citizenship and they wouldn't have to be returned to their ISIS father in Saudi Arabia or in Tunisia. They could be retained in Syria. And I checked later, and that law was passed and was implemented. But it just shows the utter cruelty. When we fight these wars, we have no limits on the cruelty and the inhumanity that we're prepared to impose on the people, making them suffer so that somehow that will translate into overthrowing the government and perhaps taking their oil, taking their resources.
Clearly the policy against Russia today by the current administration.
Yes. You know, Russia is perhaps more blessed with natural resources than any other nation on earth. They are a major producer of grain, of oil, of aluminum, of fertilizers, of an immense number of things that tie into the whole global economy. And no doubt there are people who look at this and say, you know, if we could somehow break up Russia itself, there will be fortunes made to where trillionaires will be made by the dozens. And there's some attraction to that. Certainly, you've seen some of this taking place already with foreign interests taking over Ukraine and taking their vast resources. But we began a drive towards Russia almost immediately after the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. The Soviet Union dissolved, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and unfortunately, one of the great tragedies of history is that we failed to dissolve NATO. The sole purpose of NATO was to defend against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union no longer existed. NATO went toe-to-toe with the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was gone. It no longer existed. There was no purpose in NATO continuing to exist. However, we retained it, and it could not exist unless it had an enemy. Russia was desperate to become part of the West. I met with the head of Gazprom, the largest corporation in Russia, and this was shortly after the demise of the Soviet Union. And he described for me how they were struggling to have their media be as free as it was in the West. And they perceived us as being much more free and open than we were. And he said, you know, we've got this problem because we have this uprising in Chechnya, which is part of Russia. And he said, the Chechnyan rebels send videos to Russian television, and we play them on Russian television because that's the way freedom of speech works. And I said, are you kidding me? I said, you're publishing the enemy propaganda films? He said, yeah. He said, isn't that the way you do it in the United States? I said, no. I said, in the Second World War, we took the head of the Associated Press and we put him in charge of wartime censorship. And it was very strict. But this is just an example of how they were struggling. They went from being an officially atheist country to where they became the most Christianized major nation in Europe by far. Not only were the people the most Christianized people in any major country in Europe, but the government itself was very supportive of the church, of the Christian faith. They altered their constitution to say that marriage was the union of one man and one woman. They became very restrictive on the practice of abortion. They ended the practice of overseas adoptions, where some people were going to Russia and adopting little boys for immoral purposes. So they became a totally different culture. And in any event, the United States we have this long-standing strategy, this political military strategy of expanding the empire. We did it in the Middle East, where we attempted to create a massive neo-colonial empire. It became rather frayed. The people did not want it. And it seems to be doomed to extinction sometime, but it may go on for another 100 years. But in any event, we are trying to do something similar as we roll to the east, right up virtually to the Ukrainian border, or to the Russian border, rather.
So the U.S. and U.K. position on the war in Ukraine, just over these last few weeks, has now become not only supporting the war, but victory at all costs. This has been declared by Defense Secretary Austin and others, and they are pumping in huge quantities of not only defensive but offensive military weaponry to the Kiev regime. What do you see as the consequence of this policy?
I think one thing that it will do is it will ensure that a tremendous number of innocent Ukrainian soldiers will die needlessly. A lot of Russian soldiers will die needlessly. These are kids. You know, kids go off to war. I went off to war as a kid. You think your country, right or wrong, everything they're doing is fine. It breaks my heart when I look at the faces of young Russian boys who have been gunned down, in some cases very criminally by Ukrainian forces. And likewise, I see Ukrainian young men who are being slaughtered on the battlefield. We don't care. The United States and NATO, we do not care how many Ukrainians die. Not civilians, not women, not children, not soldiers. We do not care. It's become a great football game. You know, we've got our team, they've got our team, rah, rah. We want to get the biggest score and run it up. And, you know, we don't care how many of our players get crippled on the playing field, as long as we win. Now, we are shipping fantastic quantities of weapons, and it's caused the stock of Raytheon, which creates missiles, and Northrop Grumman, which creates aircraft and so forth, and missiles. All of these defense industries have become tremendously bloated with tax dollars. I don't think it's ultimately going to change the outcome. I think that Russia will prevail. The Ukrainians are in a very awkward strategic position in the East. But if you look at the way that this unfolded, President Putin made a desperate effort to